The wind in Wyoming in 1875 was a constant companion, a rough hand that tugged at skirts and whispered secrets through the tall prairie grass. For Sarah, it was just another part of her hard life. She was a woman built of sturdy stuff, like the tough sagebrush that clung to the dry earth. Her hands, though small, were strong from years of work, callous from holding reins, scrubbing clothes, and tending a small, stubborn garden. Her eyes, the color of a clear summer sky, held a quiet strength, a knowing that life wasn't easy, but it was hers to live. Every morning, before the sun fully climbed over the jagged peaks, Sarah was up. She'd pull on her simple dress and sturdy boots, braid her long brown hair, and start her day. There was always something to do in their small, rough cabin, which was less a home and more a shelter against the vast, wild land. She fetched water from the creek, chopped kindling for the fire, and tried to make what little they had stretch a long way. The dust seemed to settle on everything, a fine, persistent powder that reminded her of the endless struggle. She rarely complained, not out loud anyway. What good would it do? The world around her was beautiful in its own wild way, with wide open spaces and skies that stretched forever, but it was also unforgiving. Every day was a test of grit and will. Sarah had plenty of both. She watched the seasons change, from the harsh bite of winter to the brief, vibrant bloom of spring, and knew that, like the land, she too had to endure. This was her life, plain and unvarnished, a constant dance with the elements and the daily grind of survival in a land that demanded everything you had. While Sarah faced the world with quiet strength, her greatest challenge often came from within the walls of their small cabin. Her husband, Frank, was a shadow that darkened their home. He was a man who had lost his way, his spirit slowly drowned by too much whiskey. In the beginning, there had been hope, a flicker of kindness that Sarah had clung to, but over the years, the drink had taken hold of him completely. Frank spent his days either sleeping off a drunk or looking for more alcohol. His words were often harsh, flung like stones that left bruises on Sarah's heart. He didn't work much, and what little money he found quickly vanished into the bottom of a bottle. Sarah did her best to ignore his sharp tongue and the way his eyes, once bright, now looked dull and uncaring. She tried to remember the man he used to be before the drink stole him away, but it was like chasing smoke. His unkindness was not always loud. Sometimes it was the silence, the way he would sit, staring blankly, making the small cabin feel cold and empty even on a warm day. Sarah cooked, cleaned, and cared for what little they had, while Frank did little but consume. She learned to keep her feelings locked away, a treasure chest of hurts she never opened. It was safer that way. The wind outside might be wild, but the unpredictable storms inside their home were far more painful. Sarah wished for things to be different, but wishing couldn't change a man who didn't want to change himself. Her life was hard because of the land, but harder still because of Frank. The wagon was more than just a wagon. It was their only link to the outside world, their means to trade, to travel, to carry the meager harvest from Sarah's garden town. It was old and creaky, patched in places, but Sarah cared for it like it was a prized possession, oiling its wheels and mending its worn canvas cover. It represented a small piece of their future, a sliver of hope that they might one day move to a place where life was a little less harsh. One morning, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the smell of stale whiskey and a silence that was more chilling than any of Frank's angry outbursts. Sarah had been out gathering wild herbs, her basket heavy with fragrant leaves, when she noticed it. The spot where the wagon usually stood, beside their cabin, was empty. Her heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked around, then looked again, her mind refusing to believe what her eyes were seeing. The wagon, their only wagon, was gone. A cold dread seeped into her bones. Frank was nowhere to be seen. She ran to the nearest neighbor's cabin, a good mile away, her breath ragged. Mrs. Olson, a kind woman with a knowing look, met her at the door. "He traded it, dear," she said softly, her voice filled with pity. "Frank, he took it into town yesterday. Traded it for a few bottles at the saloon." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her knees felt weak, and she leaned against the doorframe for support. Traded it for drinks. Her wagon, their future, gone for a few hours of forgetfulness. It wasn't just the loss of the wagon. It was the final, crushing blow to any lingering hope she had for Frank, for their life together. He had left her truly stranded, with nothing but the dust beneath her feet and the vast, empty Wyoming sky above. The silence of the missing wagon screamed louder than any shout. The world, which had always been a challenging place for Sarah, now felt utterly bleak. The news of the wagon, traded for Frank's vice, left her hollowed out like a dry creek bed after a long summer. She walked back to her empty cabin, the silence heavier than any burden she had ever carried. The sun, usually a welcome sight, seemed too bright, too uncaring of her sorrow. Every familiar object in the cabin, from the chipped cup on the table to the worn blanket on the bed, seemed to mock her with its helplessness. Tears, which Sarah rarely allowed herself, now welled up and spilled over, tracing hot paths down her dusty cheeks. She sank onto the rough wooden stool, burying her face in her hands. How could she go on? The wagon had been more than just a tool. It was her way to get to town, to sell her eggs and herbs, to buy the few necessities they couldn't make or grow. Without it, they were truly isolated, cut off from everything. It meant no income, no supplies, no way to escape the harsh reality of their lonely existence. The future stretched before her, a dark, empty road with no end in sight. She felt a kind of despair she hadn't known before, a heavy blanket that smothered her spirit. All her usual strength seemed to have drained away, leaving her weak and lost. She had always found a way, always picked herself up, but this time the blow felt too great. She looked out the small window at the endless prairie, feeling smaller and more alone than she ever had in her life. What would she do? How would she survive? The questions echoed in her mind, unanswered and terrifying. Not far from Sarah's lonely cabin, on the edge of the small town, stood a blacksmith shop. It was a smoky, noisy place, filled with the clang of hammer on anvil and the roar of the forge. The man who worked there was named Thomas. He was a quiet man, broad-shouldered and strong, with hands that could shape hot metal as easily as he could mend a delicate hinge. His face was often smudged with soot, but his eyes, a warm brown, missed little. Thomas had known Sarah and Frank for years. He had watched, like many in town, as Frank's troubles grew and as Sarah's spirits seemed to dim. He saw her come to town less and less, her shoulders a little more stooped each time. He noticed the worn state of their wagon, and then he noticed its absence. He heard the whispers, too, about Frank trading it for liquor. The news settled heavy in his gut. He didn't speak much, but he thought a great deal. He saw the way Sarah carried herself, even in her sadness, with a quiet dignity. He saw the way she tended her garden, even when it seemed hopeless. And he saw the raw despair in her eyes when she finally learned the truth about the wagon. He didn't offer empty words of comfort, for he knew words couldn't mend what was broken in her life. Instead, a different idea began to form in his steady, thoughtful mind. He looked around his busy shop, at the piles of scrap metal, the old wheels, the bits of wood and leather that others had thrown away. He saw not junk, but possibility. He saw a way to help, without a single word needing to be spoken. Thomas knew that sometimes the kindest act wasn't talk, but simply doing. The very next day, Thomas began his secret project. He didn't tell anyone, not even his occasional customers. He simply started sorting through the jumble of metal and wood that filled the back corner of his shop. To an outsider, it looked like a pile of useless junk. Rusted wagon wheel rims, splintered planks, bent axles, and scraps of iron that had seen better days. But Thomas saw beyond the rust and decay. He saw the heart of a new wagon. He worked on it in the quiet hours, after his regular customers had left and the sun dipped below the horizon. The rhythmic clang of his hammer, usually a sound of daily business, now held a different purpose. He carefully straightened bent iron, welded broken pieces together, and painstakingly shaped new parts from old. He found four sturdy, if mismatched, wheels that could be repaired and fitted. He planed rough with smooth, choosing the strongest pieces to form the wagon bed. His brow was often furrowed in concentration, his hands moving with the practiced skill of a true craftsman. He wasn't building a fancy wagon, but a practical one, built to last, built for the hard Wyoming roads. He thought of Sarah's strong hands, her quiet resilience, and put that same spirit into every nail and every joint. The wagon was taking shape slowly, piece by careful piece, each part cleaned, mended, or reshaped from forgotten remnants. No one knew what Thomas was doing, and that was just how he wanted it. This was a gift, a silent promise of help, forged in the heat of his forge and the quiet determination of his heart. Thomas worked tirelessly, fueled by a quiet purpose that burned brighter than his forge. During the day, he hammered out horseshoe nails and repaired farm tools for his paying customers, the usual sounds of his trade filling the air. But as soon as the last customer left and the sun began its slow descent, he turned to his hidden project. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows as he toiled, the rhythmic clang-clang-clang of his hammer echoing softly in the stillness of the evening. He welded and pounded, shaped and smoothed, his strong hands moving with a tireless rhythm. Sometimes the work was frustrating. A piece wouldn't fit just right, or an old bolt would stubbornly resist removal. But Thomas never gave up. He saw Sarah's weary face in his mind, and that image spurred him on. He wanted this wagon to be truly strong, sturdy enough to handle the rough Wyoming trails, a vessel of hope that wouldn't break down under the weight of her burdens. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts. He'd wake before dawn, his muscles aching, but his resolve firm. He'd spend an hour or two on the wagon before opening his shop, adding another plank, tightening another bolt. The wooden bed began to take shape, the iron frame growing solid. He even found a worn but serviceable canvas for a cover, patching it with sturdy thread. Each day, the collection of scrap transformed more and more into something new, something full of purpose. His efforts were a silent testament to his kindness, a tangible act of caring for a woman who had known too little of it. He worked with a quiet determination, pouring his strength and skill into every piece, building not just a wagon, but a fresh start. Finally, after weeks of tireless work, the wagon was ready. It wasn't perfect with its mismatched wheels and patched canvas, but it was strong. It was a testament to grit and silent kindness. Thomas stood back, wiping sweat from his brow, a rare, small smile touching his lips. He knew he couldn't just leave it at her cabin. Frank might try to trade again. He had to deliver it, and he had to do it in a way that truly helped Sarah. One early morning, before the sun had fully chased away the shadows, Thomas hitched his own horse to the newly built wagon. He drove it slowly, carefully, along the dusty track leading to Sarah's cabin. The air was still and cool, the only sound the gentle creak of the wagon wheels. As he approached, he saw Sarah already outside, tending her small, stubborn garden, her back to him. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped a little more than usual. He stopped the wagon a short distance from her. The sudden silence made her turn. Her eyes, wide with surprise, first saw the horse, then the wagon. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a wagon, a real wagon, sitting there as if by magic. Her gaze moved from a sturdy wooden bed to the patched canvas, then to the quiet man holding the reins. Thomas simply looked at her, his warm brown eyes holding a depth of understanding. He didn't say a word, just nodded slightly, a silent offering. Sarah slowly walked towards it, her steps hesitant, as if approaching something too good to be true. She touched the smooth wood of the side, her fingers tracing the strong ironwork. She looked back at Thomas, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. No words were needed. In that moment, the weight of her despair lifted, replaced by a surge of overwhelming gratitude and a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in a very long time. It was a new beginning delivered by a quiet hand. Sarah's heart swelled with a mix of wonder and deep gratitude as she stood before the sturdy wagon. It wasn't fancy, but it was real, solid, and a clear sign that someone cared. She looked at Thomas, her eyes still wet, trying to find words to thank him, but none felt big enough. He simply gave another small nod, his eyes telling her he understood. Despite the joy and relief that washed over her, a quiet understanding settled in Sarah's mind. The wagon was a miracle, a gift of immense kindness, but it was just the first step. Her old life, tied to Frank and the empty cabin, was broken beyond repair. She couldn't stay. The future still stretched out, vast and unknown, like the endless Wyoming sky. She knew she had to leave, to find a new place, a new way to make her life. The wagon meant she wasn't stranded, but it didn't mean the journey ahead would be easy. She had to pack the few belongings she truly treasured: some worn clothes, a blanket, her gardening tools, a small locket from her mother. She would need supplies for the road, food and water that would last until she reached a new settlement. The thought of starting completely fresh, alone, was daunting. The Wyoming landscape, while beautiful, was also harsh, full of challenges for a lone woman. But now, with a wagon, she had a chance, a real chance. Her gratitude to Thomas was immense, but the weight of the long, lonely road still pressed upon her. She was thankful, yes, but also keenly aware that her hardest journey was just beginning. Sarah spent the next few days preparing, packing her meager belongings into the new wagon, her movements still heavy with the weight of her past, but now also tinged with a fragile hope. She hitched the horse, the same one Thomas had used to deliver the wagon, and made ready to leave. The morning she planned to depart was clear and cool, a perfect day for a new beginning. Yet her heart was heavy with the enormity of what lay ahead. As she swung herself up onto the wagon seat, a figure appeared on the dusty path leading from town. It was Thomas. He carried a small pack on his back and held a sturdy walking stick in his hand. He stopped a few feet from the wagon, his gaze steady as he met Sarah's surprised eyes. "You shouldn't go alone," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It was the first time he had spoken more than a few words to her in months, maybe years. "The road is long, and it can be dangerous. I can walk with you, at least for a ways." Sarah stared at him, speechless. The offer was so unexpected, so kind, that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. To have someone, anyone, offer to face the unknown with her was a comfort she hadn't dared to dream of. The thought of the lonely miles ahead had been a cold knot in her stomach, but now a flicker of warmth began to spread. "You would do that?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Thomas nodded. "Someone should look out for that fine wagon," he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. Then he simply turned and began to walk, slowly, steadily, ahead of the horse. Sarah watched him go for a moment, then took up the reins, guiding the horse to follow. The journey was still long, but suddenly she wasn't quite so alone. The vast, empty landscape seemed a little less daunting with his broad back leading the way. The days on the trail blended into a steady rhythm of footsteps, creaking wheels, and the vast, quiet expanse of Wyoming. Thomas walked beside the wagon, his presence a steady anchor in Sarah's new, uncertain world. They didn't speak much, not at first. Thomas was a man of few words, and Sarah, having lived so long with Frank's harshness, had grown accustomed to keeping her thoughts to herself. Yet in their silence, a different kind of understanding began to grow. Sarah watched him. She saw the way his eyes scanned the horizon, always watchful. She noticed how he would gently guide the horse around a rocky patch, or how he'd stop to tighten a loose bolt on the wagon wheel without being asked. He would build a small, safe fire each evening and share the meager ration she had packed, always making sure she had enough. He never rushed her, never pushed, simply walked at her pace, a silent, comforting shadow. And Thomas, in turn, observed Sarah. He saw the strength in her tired stride, the quiet determination in her gaze as she faced each new mile. He saw how she cared for the horse, how she carefully rationed their water, how she looked at the wildflowers they passed with a soft, appreciative glance. He understood the unspoken burdens she carried, the weight of a past she was trying to leave behind. There was no need for long talks or explanations. A shared glance, a small gesture, was often enough. The quiet understanding between them deepened with every sunrise and every sunset, a bond forged not in words, but in shared effort and mutual respect under the wide, open sky. The journey across the vast Wyoming landscape was not without its trials. One afternoon, a sudden, fierce thunderstorm rolled in, turning the dusty trail into a muddy bog. The wagon wheels sank deep, threatening to tip over. Sarah, usually so steady, felt a surge of panic. But Thomas, without a word, was already at the back of the wagon, bracing it with his shoulder. Sarah quickly unhitched the horse, guiding it to firmer ground. Together, they found large stones and branches to place under the wheels, slowly, painstakingly prying the wagon free. Their movements were in sync, a silent dance of shared effort, each knowing what the other needed to do. Another time, their water supply ran dangerously low under a scorching sun. Thomas, with his keen eye, spotted a faint trail leading towards what he hoped was a hidden spring. He walked ahead, testing the ground, while Sarah followed carefully with the wagon. They found a trickle of fresh, cold water, just enough to fill their canteens and refresh the weary horse. It was a small victory, but a vital one, achieved through his foresight and their combined perseverance. They also faced the loneliness of the open land. Days could pass without seeing another soul, and the silence could be heavy. Yet, even in this vast emptiness, they found comfort in each other's presence. When a wolf howled too close to their campfire one night, Thomas simply added more wood to the flames and sat a little closer, his presence a silent shield. Sarah, in turn, would share the last of her dried berries or a piece of hardtack, a small offering of shared comfort. Each challenge met, each obstacle overcome, strengthened the unspoken bond between them, proving their individual resilience and their growing teamwork. With each sunrise that found them still on the trail, and each sunset that brought them closer to an unknown destination, Sarah and Thomas's bond grew stronger. It wasn't a loud or flashy kind of caring, but something deeper, woven into the fabric of their shared struggle. Sarah found herself watching for Thomas's quiet reassurance, a nod or a steady glance that told her everything would be all right. She started leaving him the warmest spot by the campfire or making sure he had enough coffee in the mornings. Small gestures, but full of meaning. Thomas, for his part, found himself thinking of Sarah constantly. He'd mend her worn boots by the firelight or sharpen her small gardening spade, always without a word, simply because he saw the need. He started telling her little stories about the land, about animals he'd seen, or old tales from his youth, seeing the way her eyes would brighten. Her quiet strength and gentle spirit were a balm to his own steady, solitary nature. They relied on each other in ways they hadn't realized they would. When Sarah was tired, Thomas would walk a little slower or take on a heavier task. When Thomas was lost in thought, Sarah would quietly point out a landmark or a change in the weather. They became a unit, two people moving as one against the vastness of the prairie. The harshness of the journey, instead of breaking them, had instead forged a connection between them, a quiet, deep care that spoke louder than any words. They were no longer just two individuals traveling, but two souls looking out for each other, finding comfort and strength in their shared efforts. As the days turned into weeks and the miles stretched behind them, the quiet care between Sarah and Thomas slowly deepened into something more profound. It wasn't a sudden, fiery passion, but a gentle, steady warmth, like embers glowing brighter in the heart of a well-tended fire. For Sarah, Thomas's unwavering presence, his silent strength, and his thoughtful kindness were like a healing balm to old wounds. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen, truly cared for, without demands or judgment. His steady gaze held respect, not harshness, and in it, she found a reflection of her own worth. For Thomas, Sarah was a revelation. Her resilience, her quiet spirit, her gentle way with the horse, and the few plants she tried to keep alive in a small pot on the wagon, all drew him in. He had lived a solitary life, content with his work, but now a new feeling bloomed in his chest. He looked forward to their quiet evenings by the fire, the way the starlight caught in her hair, the soft curve of her smile when he told a simple story. He realized he was no longer just helping her. He wanted to be with her. The unspoken feelings grew, a fragile flower in the harsh landscape. There were moments when their hands brushed as they passed a cup of water, or when their eyes met over the flickering fire. And in those brief instants, a truth was understood without a single word. It was a feeling of deep connection, of belonging, of a future that for the first time seemed less daunting and more inviting. It was a special feeling, like love, growing from the very soil of their shared silence and unbreakable grit. Finally, their journey brought them to a small, green valley tucked away by a winding river. It was a place of gentle slopes and good earth, a stark contrast to the harsh, dry plains they had left behind. They both knew, without a single word, that this was where their new beginning would take root. They set about building a small cabin, not just a shelter, but a true home, together. Thomas, with his blacksmith skill, shaped the metal hinges and latches, while Sarah, with her green thumb, planned a garden that would burst with life. Life was still hard, as it always was in the wild country, but now it was filled with a different kind of richness. The quiet moments they shared by the fire were no longer just moments of shared silence, but moments of shared happiness. Sarah would hum as she cooked, a soft melody she hadn't sung in years. Thomas would watch her, a contented smile often playing on his lips, a smile she had come to cherish. They worked side by side, building their future piece by piece, just as Thomas had built the wagon from scrap. They had found more than just a place to live. They had found each other. The love that had grown from their shared silence and grit was a strong, steady force, a beacon of hope in a world that could be cruel. Sarah no longer felt the cold dread of an empty future, and Thomas no longer felt the quiet ache of a solitary life. Together, in that small valley, under the vast Wyoming sky, they had found not just a new beginning, but a lasting happiness built on kindness, understanding, and a love as true and enduring as the land itself.